Zombie games are a dime a dozen these days. In the mid-1990s, the Resident Evil games were so awesome and unique that they got me into the whole genre to begin with, but since then we've seen nearly every possible variation of zombie video games. While some may consider Valve and Turtle Rock Studios' Left 4 Dead to be the apex of the genre, Resident Evil has been holding strong for 15 years, and in 2013, Sony-owned studio Naughty Dog made a big splash with their landmark cinematic PS3 exclusive, The Last of Us. Released at the height of AMC's The Walking Dead show's popularity, The Last of Us used a zombie, or at least zombie-like, apocalypse as its setting, but the focus was really on the human characters. This is best exemplified in the game's opening sequence, in which you play as a young girl on the first night of the fungal zombie outbreak. While trying to escape, their vehicle is in an accident and the girl is rendered unable to walk, so you then take control as her father, who attempts to carry her to safety. This culminates in a tense encounter with a soldier who fires his weapon, and while he misses the current player character, the girl who you originally controlled is hit, and you're forced to watch her die in the arms of her father, who is totally powerless to save her.
Listen to me, I know this hurts. You're gonna be okay, baby, stay with me. I'm gonna pick you up. I know, baby, I know it hurts. Come on, baby, please. I know, baby, I know. Sarah. Baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Come on. No. No. No, no, no. Please. 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 Please don't. Please.
At the time, this was one of the most shocking and memorable openings to a video game ever produced, and while the game which followed had clunky but serviceable gameplay for the time, it was the story of that father, Joel, rediscovering his humanity via his growing friendship with a girl named Ellie, which solidified The Last of Us as a landmark storytelling moment in the medium. Last year, Naughty Dog released their very divisive sequel, The Last of Us Part 2, which, while critically lauded by the mainstream press, has had a mixed reception from the audience. Initially, this was due to a story leak where we found out that in the first few hours of the game, Joel would be unceremoniously and very brutally murdered, which put many fans of the original on edge, but after the game came out, it continued to divide players. Some people got into the story with its generally high standard of dialogue writing, barring a few awkwardly written moments.
What you got there?
Bigot sandwiches.
As well as its undeniably strong performances, combined with industry-leading motion capture and some very aesthetically pleasing visuals.
Me too, that's stupid. And one thing you're gonna need a rope for. I don't fucking know what you're gonna need it for. They just always need it.
These fans would frequently hold The Last of Us Part 2 as not only a good game, but as another medium-defining masterpiece, on par with, if not exceeding, its predecessor's quality. On the other side of the fence, players were disappointed with the awkwardly structured story, which had two protagonists bouncing between flashbacks within flashbacks, and moments which could be argued very competently as cheap emotional manipulations.
Hey, girl. Hey, you crazy dog.
There's my favorite girl.
The only one that'll put up with your shit.
Not to mention contrived story moments in which previously competent characters decide to become total idiots in order to set up plot developments. While I find myself squarely on the negative side of things, after playing through The Last of Us Part 2 myself, I found my problems with the game were even deeper than the story which was being told. I immediately noticed that the interactivity in this game was very limited in many sequences, and no, I'm not talking about being able to shoot produce. I understand that Naughty Dog enjoys making cinematic and very guided experiences, but what was novel in the original game's Left Behind DLC quickly became very tedious to me. There was a whole lot of walking around, following a character, and eventually pushing a button to progress. The whole first hour of the game is little more than a long string of these sequences. I figured things would improve when I found myself in combat, but I was met with disappointment there as well. I don't particularly like playing any shooters on a controller these days, but going from Returnal, which feels absolutely incredible, to The Last of Us Part 2 is jarring to say the least. Naughty Dog has never been fantastic with shooting mechanics, but it seemed like there has been absolutely no improvement between the two Last of Us games, which launched 7 years apart. When I did land a shot on target, the rewards were certainly there, as this game does death animations very, very well, but the limited ammo count on the hard difficulty combined with the horrible shooting controls were both very frustrating. The ammo count was also handled in a way which felt much more cheap than it did immersive. And yes, I voluntarily chose the hard difficulty, thinking it would force me to engage with the game's mechanics more and gain a better understanding of them. What I found was that while I was still finding ammo in random household drawers, I would find 1 or 2 rounds at a time at maximum. And when I killed enemies holding firearms who would shoot me if they spotted me, they would drop little to no ammo when I killed them. I couldn't help but feel that would have been much more immersive if I was finding little to no ammo in the environment, while actively engaging with and killing enemies who were holding guns or bows would reward me with appropriate spoils. Not to mention, it seemed like the amount of ammo that I could carry was shockingly low, and both of the playable characters are wearing backpacks. Bullets aren't really that big, everybody. You can fit a lot of them in a backpack. Not only that, but you're forced to engage with enemies because despite being a stealth action game, nearly every sequence in this game where stealth is emphasized as your primary method of approach is actually a bottled combat arena, which all but requires you to kill every enemy in order to move on, dogs included. This is handled by putting a large heavy door at the end of nearly every encounter, requiring you to hold triangle or tap square, which makes noise and alerts the enemies of your presence. As a result, stealth is only used as a method to thin the enemy ranks before an inevitable battle, not as a means to bypass combat or detection entirely. This, by the way, would be totally fine if the protagonists of this game were consciously trying to kill all the enemies in their path, but in nearly every scenario, their goal is simply to progress. There are only a few circumstances in which killing every enemy is the stated goal. It should, and in a more flexible game, it would be possible to do at least a minimal kill run, if not a no kill run of the game. But it's not. You almost always have to go loud, and almost always have to kill every enemy in order to continue. The result of which becomes bad stealth game design with bad shooting mechanics, which looks absolutely stunning and has great presentation. But games don't have to be perfect in all categories, so if the story and character writing were airtight, a lot of this stuff would be forgivable to an extent, or if the narrative experience was engaging on its own. Telltale games Quantic Dream and Supermassive have all constructed their catalogs around narrative-heavy games with simplistic, tap-the-button gameplay, so there is value in a game which simply moves you through a story. But the games of all those companies give you choices. You are given no choice in The Last of Us Part 2 beyond your tactical approaches, and as I mentioned earlier, those are superficial and will almost always funnel you toward all-out combat. So what you're left with is an incredibly linear game with a story which I would argue is flat-out bad, with very limited interactivity and gameplay mechanics which oscillate between being poorly executed, like the shooting, and poorly designed, like the encounters and by extension the stealth. Yet this game is lauded by the mainstream press as a 10 out of 10, Game of the Year, generation-defining masterpiece. How, I ask? How? How? This question bothered me back when I thought this was a pretty game with what was probably good gameplay and a bad story, and is even more haunting now that I know it's a pretty game with bad gameplay and a bad story. But the real knife, the thing which hurts the most, is that Sony and the press have propped this game up while abandoning a much better game. Days Gone is the other Sony Interactive Entertainment zombie game. The Bastard Child one, the 6 out of 10 one, the generic open world one, the why do we need this when we have The Last of Us one. History has played out that this is clearly the official story, as the pitch for Days Gone 2 has been denied by Sony, while the majority of mainstream gaming media insists that The Last of Us Part 2 is a masterpiece, for which all criticisms are the result of unwarranted misogyny, homophobia, or transphobia. Part of this is because Days Gone launched rough on the PS4 in 2019, with critics having game code which was even less stable than the already broken version which apparently went out to week 1 customers. While I was looking forward to this game, even I avoided it when it launched because I heard that its frame rate was incredibly bad and that the shooting mechanics were really wonky, two things which really bother me to no end in video games. These problems resulted in sales which failed to meet Sony's target, even though ultimately, as the game's publisher, they are the ones who sent it out to die before it was ready, likely in order to give The Last of Us Part 2 a wide enough berth for its original release date. I'm not basing that on any hard evidence, it's just a theory, but the two games share enough common elements that I imagine Sony found themselves in a position where Naughty Dog, their golden goose, could be threatened. That is not to say they are the exact same type of game, as Days Gone is far from being the linear, ultra-scripted experience which The Last of Us Part 2 is. Instead, Days Gone puts you in a reasonably sized open-world map set in Oregon where you play as Deacon St. John, a biker bounty hunter 2 years after the zombie apocalypse. In a lot of ways, it feels like Daryl from The Walking Dead, the game. Norman Reedus was busy with another PS4 exclusive which eventually came to the PC, but luckily Sam Witwer, the actor who played Starkiller in The Force Unleashed, puts in an awesome performance as Deacon. Despite the great performances from Witwer as well as James Peary playing Deacon's MC brother Boozer and various other characters, The Last of Us does have higher production value in the cinematics. Some of the performance capture is on par in both games, but Days Gone, for example, has a fade to black between all gameplay and cinematics, while The Last of Us Part 2 has seamless scene transitions. This may not sound like a big deal, and honestly it isn't, but it definitely hurts the immersion in Days Gone at least a little bit. The tightly controlled nature of a linear game may allow this to happen more easily, but considering games like Red Dead Redemption 2, which has a fair amount in common with Days Gone, manage to also have seamless scene transitions, I'm more inclined to think that budget is the likely culprit. Days Gone being on a tight budget, at least relative to other Sony tentpole exclusives, is somewhat understandable due to Bend being primarily used as a portable gaming studio for the last couple generations. They developed the shockingly high-tech PSP Siphon Filter games, as well as PSP's Resistance Retribution, and even a stint in Naughty Dog's own sandbox with PlayStation Vita's Uncharted Golden Abyss. Days Gone was their first major home console game, so its launch issues may have been a combination of being a project which was more ambitious than the team was used to, and Sony not having enough confidence in them to dedicate the required time and resources for polish and quality assurance. Even close to 3 years after its initial PS4 release, the Steam port of Days Gone is far from perfect and has more optimization issues than I'd normally be cool with. The most notable of which is a seemingly ever-present frame stutter while you're riding your motorcycle around the open world. While I was getting between 70 and 120 FPS at almost all times with the G-Sync monitor, every few seconds I would get a big, noticeable hitch. The game is still very playable and I did sort of get used to it, but it's absolutely there and I hope Bend is given the opportunity to iron that out. Luckily, when on foot, even in situations where dynamic weather hits, the frame stutters seem to go away or at least become far less noticeable. The Last of Us Part 2 is not without its bugs either, as I even hit one critical game-breaking glitch personally, an issue of severity beyond anything I saw in Days Gone, but on the whole, it is a much more polished experience, which clearly had a lot more resources put into QA. However, where Days Gone succeeds is the most important area that counts. Days Gone is actually a video game. Both are third-person action games with stealth elements that involve scavenging for supplies, crafting weapons or healing items on the fly, and using both ranged and melee combat to fight post-apocalyptic human factions and zombies. Both of which aren't technically zombies, but also, come on. Days Gone, however, is the one which makes you feel like you are actually scavenging a living world, which has dynamic gameplay that varies between encounters, often due to the player's decisions, but also due to emergent gameplay developments. What this means is that encounters could play out very differently for individual players based on factors like time of day, or whether there happen to be a pack of wolves or a freaker horde nearby. This is a far cry from the very canned, tightly controlled encounters found in The Last of Us, and despite the lack of cinematic flair, the result is a much more immersive experience, because you feel like the world of Days Gone exists despite your presence in it, while The Last of Us Part 2 feels like you're moving through a bunch of big-budget movie sets. Things in a movie happen the way they do in the precise way the director decides, and the most freedom you're given in The Last of Us Part 2 is whether you want the character to paw through the set you're currently moving through to gather resources, whether or not you want to stop and read the note which you find, and I suppose when, not if, you want to break stealth and engage in some clunky combat. In Days Gone, you can approach an enemy encampment any way you want, and nearly any tactic is viable if you're up to the challenge, with the exception of a few encampments which require you to move through a tunnel entrance. I also played Days Gone on hard difficulty, hard 1 specifically, and while the resources can be tight at times, it always felt like I was finding an appropriate amount of ammo in logical places. Most notably, when I kill an enemy who's just shooting at me, they will drop a weapon I can pick up, or some ammo appropriate to the weapon they were using. But you can also find ammo in places like the trunks of cop cars, which does make a degree of sense. When playing Days Gone with a controller, the combat mechanics aren't exactly incredible, but unlike The Last of Us Part 2, which as of right now can only be played with a controller, Days Gone feels fantastic when using a mouse to aim. The reticle for most weapons is very wide, making long-distance engagements quite difficult, but Deacon's focus ability, which is a bullet time skill ripped straight out of Max Payne, allows for much more precise shooting. Now, from a narrative standpoint, Deacon is supposed to be a former US Army Afghanistan veteran who then spent a decade rolling with a motorcycle club before 2 years bounty hunting in the zombie apocalypse. So his skilled shooting does make more narrative sense for the character than it would for either of the playable characters in The Last of Us Part 2, and the input device difference should be accounted for as well, but when all is said and done, the gunfights in Days Gone were just a far better gameplay experience. Over the course of the game, you're able to find experimental steroids which can boost Deacon's stamina, health, and the focus ability. Stamina would be the first one to prioritize, as Deacon runs out of breath while running faster than Cinema Roberto would in the early game, but upgrading the focus ability makes it a breeze to land precision headshots on multiple freakers or human marauders during the larger battles. The melee combat also feels quite a bit more developed, at least further into the game when you've achieved some upgrades. The Last of Us Part 2 does have a pretty slick dodge button mechanic, while Days Gone operates on a stamina system that lets you dodge roll freely. While the former makes for some aesthetically satisfying moments, the latter feels much more dynamic and gives you the freedom to strategically position yourself while you're dodging attacks. This is much more effective when fighting multiple enemies, which both games have you doing very often. Melee weapon modification is present in both games as well. In The Last of Us, upgraded weapons turn into very limited use one-hit kill devices, while in Days Gone you can use generic scrap in order to maintain weapons over several battles. All weapons other than your boot knife can still break in Days Gone, but if you're diligent about maintenance and resource management, and have unlocked the melee weapon repair skill, you can carry one weapon with you through the whole game if you want. The Last of Us does have an edge when it comes to ranged weapon modifications. The gun porn which happens in that game when you find a workbench is hotter than the incredibly awkward sex scenes. Days Gone, on the other hand, has a much larger variety of guns, but with only limited modifications available for a few of them, like larger mags. In addition to the steroid stat upgrades, there are 3 skill trees in Days Gone that each offer a variety of perks which greatly expand your ability to deal with threats, such as more melee damage, minor healing from headshot kills, or most importantly, enhanced ranged weapon precision, but no single skill is absolutely necessary. Not only that, your character level has nothing at all to do with your damage output, only the weapon which you're holding does. What this means is that if you do some clever scavenging, use appropriate strategy, and have a little luck, you can tackle any threat the game presents you from the get-go. While hunting for upgrades early on, I even ended up clearing a freaker horde, albeit after several attempts, about 30 hours prior to horde combat being formally introduced to the gameplay. I honestly wish more games would do this, as it's much more immersive game design than simply level gating arbitrarily. Even with a tier 1 weapon, a bullet to the head will kill a human or a standard freaker, with the only bullet sponge enemies being the mutated heavy freakers which are found later in the game. The human enemies which you encounter later on have more survivability as well, but this is in the form of dynamic helmets and armor which can be shot off. You will never wander into an area in which the enemies are just a higher level than you, leaving you unable to do any real damage. Bullets are bullets in this game, and your targets will react to them accordingly. The motorcycle you ride is a critical part of the game design as well, and I found this to be one of the most engaging aspects of Days Gone. Your bike is a fixed object in the game. With the exception of being able to have mechanics recover your bike if you find yourself in a camp without it, your bike is always wherever you left it. Exploring on foot is often the best approach for tackling objectives, as your noisy Harley will certainly alert both marauders and freakers alike, so positioning your bike in a spot where you can easily reach it is a key strategic element. Do you keep it close and risk alerting enemies on your approach or allowing enemies to get behind it? Or far away where you may have to run a great distance in order to escape if things get hairy? Being able to make that kind of choice really helps the player feel like an active participant rather than a passive observer. The bike mechanic isn't without its downsides, as while fueling and maintenance of your bike is another element which helps create immersion, the starting fuel tank your bike has is painfully small. I do understand the design purpose of this, as it does force the player to be mindful of their fuel early on when they're learning the mechanics of the game and traversing the comparatively short distances in the early game, but it is a little much and might take more away from the immersion than scrounging for fuel adds. That being said, tow trucks with spare fuel cans, gas stations with miraculously working pumps, and friendly camps with bike shops that provide reasonably priced refueling are all plentiful, so you rarely find yourself without the ability to find fuel with a reasonable degree of ease. It's just a bit weird to not be able to get 2 kilometers on a tank initially. As you progress further into the game and become more friendly with the settlement camps, which you can accomplish by running main missions, side missions, or simply clearing out nearby freaker infestations, their mechanics will be willing to sell you all sorts of upgrades to your bike, including larger fuel tanks. All of this makes taking care of your bike very engaging, or at least much more so than simply calling the vehicle which then magically appears nearby. The only other game in recent memory which gave me the same feeling of cherishing my means of transportation are the horses from Red Dead Redemption 2. Speaking of which, Red Dead Redemption 2 is probably the game I would most closely compare Days Gone to. Both cast you as a hard-ass vagrant who takes on odd jobs in order to make your way in a harsh world. The production values of Red Dead Redemption 2 are far and away much higher than those in Days Gone, and the world simply feels much more alive, being a turn-of-the-century frontier story rather than a post-apocalypse, but the two games share a lot in common. I'd go as far to say that if you enjoyed Red Dead Redemption 2, Days Gone would be a pretty safe recommendation, as in addition to a similar feel, they share the same shortcomings as well. The most significant of which is their pacing, which in both games is not really a good thing or a bad thing objectively. You are either going to really like getting sucked into the world of Days Gone and making your way through a story which has multiple arcs and feels almost like two distinct, full seasons of a TV show, or you're going to wonder why this game is 50 hours long and get bored and frustrated. It would be pretty hard for me to talk about this pacing without going into story details, so if you've never played Days Gone and you plan to, skip to this timecode to avoid story spoilers. The game opens with a cinematic which takes place 2 years prior to the game, in which Deacon loads his wife Sarah onto a helicopter after she was injured during the initial outbreak. Deacon elects to stay behind because while there is room on the evac chopper, he refuses to leave his MC brother Boozer. The game then moves 2 years to the present, seeing Boozer and Deacon still wearing their MC cuts and acting as bounty hunters in the new Wild West. Or Wild Pacific Northwest, I suppose. One of the first things which happens in the game is that Boozer is attacked by 2 members of the Ripper cult. These crazy cult members want to be more like the Freaker zombies and achieve this by mutilating themselves and others, so some horrible things happen to Boozer's right arm. Third-degree burns are a pretty serious problem in a world with no hospitals, so the majority of the first quarter of the game has you gaining reputation with 2 survivor camps in order to accrue the supplies you need to save Boozer. These 2 camps do have pretty interesting lore, but ultimately they aren't very important to the main story beyond acting as side quest dispensaries. The first camp is the very based and red-pilled libertarian camp of Marc Copeland, host of the only radio talk show which appears to exist, Radio Free Oregon. The second is the Hot Springs camp run by Tucker, a former prison warden who treats her workers like slaves. It's pretty interesting to interact with both camps and hear their different leadership philosophies, but the main story really picks up when Boozer's arm takes a turn for the worse and forces Deacon to make amends with a more well-equipped camp whom he has estranged from over the past year. The Lost Lake camp, run by the very charismatic and very well-acted Iron Mike, becomes something of a home base for the rest of the first act. You meet and get to know the people who live there, like Ricky, the awesome biker chick, and her girlfriend Addie, the veterinarian turned doctor, as well as Skizzo, the camp's security lead, who is pretty much as scummy as you'd imagine a guy named Skizzo might be. It becomes apparent as you interact with these characters that there is much more to them than is initially apparent. There's a particularly good scene in which Ricky is dressing one of Deacon's wounds with some extremely heavy sexual tension. It doesn't go anywhere, as despite his acceptance of his wife's probable death at the time, he seems reluctant to hurt Ricky's partner. The moment doesn't seem trashy or exploitative though, it just feels like an honest and mature situation which 2 adults at the end of the world might find themselves in.
Ricky, I'm not sure that, well, I hear that Addie doesn't really like, people messing around in her business.
Yeah, I heard that too. What about this one?
Ricky.
Deke, I'm not married. Okay. Why don't you come back tomorrow and see Addie, and she's gonna tell you how great of a job I did.
Ricky,
Deke, it's fine. You're welcome. Hey, Deacon? Maybe one day, stop and light a candle. It can get pretty dark and cold out there.
The humanity of this moment is juxtaposed quite effectively by the encounter Deacon has with Carlos, the head of the Ripper gang, when you find out that Carlos may have been put on the path he is on because he was tortured by the Mongrel Motorcycle Club. Deacon and Boozer, along with their president Jack, who never appears in the game, created a monster before the world was consumed by actual monsters. The conflict between Lost Lake Camp and the Rippers isn't cut and dry good versus evil though, as Iron Mike has a truce with them which he's determined to maintain in order to avoid needless killing. As much as this is an admirable goal, which Iron Mike remains consistent on, Schizo attempts to sell Deacon and Boozer out to the Rippers, which results in the whole conflict coming to a head. As the first act ends, the leads Deacon has been following with the FEMA-like organization Nero results in him getting a lead on his wife Sarah and the possibility that she may yet be alive. Iron Mike leads you on a path through the mountains where you find a whole new open world area to explore, this one with 2 camps run by the same faction, a heavily armed militia. This is the aspect of the game which feels like a whole other season of a TV show. The Ripper arc concludes, the militia arc begins, and the government conspiracy arc is the thread which runs behind both of them. Deacon is essentially the only returning character, and when he finds out that Sarah is not only alive but is serving as an officer in the militia, he offers his skill set as a new recruit. You meet some new and interesting characters like Sergeant Curry, Lieutenant Weaver, Dr. Jimenez, and Private Taylor, as well as who is probably the worst character in the game, Colonel Garrett. Garrett is a cartoonishly one-dimensional character who is just apocalyptically religious military guy, which is a bit of a shame because it telegraphs his eventual heel turn from a mile away. Curry, Weaver, Jimenez, and Taylor are all much better characters, most of whom have actual arcs. There is an interesting way in which Dr. Jimenez is handled in Days Gone relative to how Mel is handled in The Last of Us Part 2. The two characters share an important role in common. They are either the best or only doctors in their respective militia camps. Outside of YouTube, my job is as a Canadian Army medic, and I can say for sure that without a clinician to provide definitive care when a patient has been stabilized, the casualty numbers would absolutely skyrocket in a hostile environment. Our nurse practitioners, physician assistants, doctors, and surgeons are immeasurably valuable. So in Days Gone, when Dr. Jimenez expresses interest in going on a raid with Deacon, as much as Colonel Garrett is a very simple, one-dimensional character, even he has the sense to say what any ranking officer should say if a valuable asset is about to take an unnecessary risk.
How about new?
Meanwhile, Mel, who is referred to as one of the best surgeons in Seattle and also happens to be about to burst pregnant, goes out on a dangerous excursion with Abby and Manny with the most minimal amount of resistance.
I actually cleared you for active duty.
Barely.
You could probably get a stay if you ask.
I'd rather not sit around if I don't have to.
No one's okay with this?
Why would it be up to Owen?
Because that's also his baby! Then, not 5 minutes after they leave the WLF camp, the group finds themselves in a high-speed chase/gunfight. I did not experience what I can only imagine were the intended reactions of, oh wow, she's so brave for going on that mission while pregnant, nor, I can't believe they're in such a desperate situation that even their pregnant women need to go out on raids. All I could think was, how are all the characters involved in this scene suddenly so unbelievably stupid? It is worth noting that Mel's eventual demise is not at all related to this decision, but that's due to blind luck or plot armor. It doesn't change how stupid the inciting decision was. On the contrary, Dr. Jimenez is a victim of plot vulnerability, and that is directly related to Colonel Garrett's decision. Characters making smart decisions which have events in the story unfold in a logical manner based on circumstances that the characters couldn't predict will always make more sense than characters randomly becoming idiots so that the story can progress in the way the writer wants it to. Which brings us to Private Taylor's unexpected arc. You meet Taylor before he officially joins the militia, and his max-relaxed, stoner-like demeanor makes him seem like a simple comic relief character. After suffering an injury, he's given some OxyContin, and when this happened, I didn't even clue in to the fact that he was enjoying them a bit too much. The next time you encounter Taylor, he's killed Dr. Jimenez, who happened to not be out raiding with Deacon at the time. Instead, he was in the clinic when Taylor decided to steal all of the clinic's opiates, leading Taylor to panic and kill the doctor. Deacon sets off to find Taylor and bring him to justice. When you do find Taylor, he isn't suddenly evil or a boss which you need to kill, but a broken addict who knows he made an unforgivable mistake. He just cries and begs Deacon to not let them hang him, which is Colonel Garrett's preferred method of execution. Deacon gives Taylor a merciful death by injecting him with the remaining syringe of morphine, telling Sergeant Corey that he just died of an overdose. This sense of compassion for the weak is persistent in Deacon's character, and I really like how it hints that underneath the gruff, badass biker aesthetic, there's a good person, but a good person who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty, lie, or kill if necessary. There were a whole bunch of these shorter, interesting character stories sprinkled through the open world, and in a lot of ways, they were the highlight of Days Gone's narrative experience. However, the main story ends on a fairly predictable note, with Deacon rejoining the Lost Lake camp in order to defend them against Garrett's militia, and ultimately the ending is a fairly clean happily ever after. Or at least that's what I thought, as there is a secret epilogue which you have to do a fair amount of work to earn, but we'll talk about that work at the end of the story section because that's all gameplay, baby. You're called for a rendezvous with the neuroscientist known as O'Brien, who's been popping in and out of the story since the intro. During your last encounters with him, he mentions that the Freakers have been evolving, which seems to simply refer to the stronger Freakers like the Breakers and Reachers. However, it turns out that the zombie-like Freakers aren't the only variety, as O'Brien, and presumably most, if not all of the rest of Nero, are Freakers who have retained their human intelligence. This does sort of explain why O'Brien always seems to be afraid of the other Nero operatives, and the door is left wide open for a sequel in which Deacon explores the mystery of the virus further. Sadly, it's not likely that we will ever find out how the story progresses from there, but more on that later. In order to achieve that epilogue, you have to clear every single horde on the map, and there are over 30 of them, so that can seem like a very daunting task. Particularly because during the campaign, you're tasked with taking out a few very, very large hordes. Luckily, the hordes which need to be cleared in the endgame, for the most part, aren't nearly as insane, which might sound a bit disappointing, but after you take out 2 or 3 of them, you really get into the rhythm of being a horde hunter, which feels totally awesome. These tidal waves of enemies, which seemed like certain death to go anywhere near in the early game, suddenly become manageable threats which should be afraid of you due to your upgraded skills, your better equipment like the amazing Molotov, but most importantly, due to your developed sense of strategy, which mirrors the narrative reason why Deacon started fighting the hordes, the simple fact that he now understands how. Setting traps, funneling freakers into choke points, running constantly, timing reloads, managing your focus, and aiming quick headshots is so incredibly satisfying that you quickly get over thinking of the horde clearing as a seemingly endless grind in order to gain a little bit more story, and embrace your new role as a post-apocalyptic solo slayer of zombie hordes. I found it to be a really awesome way to cap off your time with a fantastic open world game, but it's also one which you can safely skip if you're feeling burned out by that point, because the main story has already concluded. All you'd really be missing out on is one cinematic, which does add new context to the story, but exists mostly to set up future games which aren't likely to happen. I found it interesting to learn that during development of Days Gone, Saber Interactive approached Sony about co-developing a multiplayer component for this game, as they were also working on a title which featured massive swarms of zombies in their surprisingly awesome World War Z, which can now be found on PS4 as well as Xbox and PC versions of Xbox Game Pass. The games aren't based on the same technology, and they were being developed in tandem, so this wasn't quite the case of Saber pitching Days Gone multiplayer to Sony denying them, and then Saber taking their toys to another sandbox and creating World War Z, which is the impression I was initially under before I researched it more deeply, but I do think that Sony's denial of Saber's offer does say a bit about Sony's faith in Days Gone as a project. Granted, it's been over a year since The Last of Us Part 2 launched, and we still haven't heard any solid news on the Factions mode, which was removed from the project in the middle of development, so even their Golden Child franchise is lacking the multiplayer mode which the original game sported. On that point, there are 2 reasonable theories as to why Sony turned down Saber's multiplayer pitch. The first is the most likely, which is that Sony didn't want to spend the extra money, which would have either pulled resources away from the Days Gone campaign, or increased the production budget significantly, which would put more pressure on the game to sell well in order to be considered a success. The crazier theory is that Sony knew The Last of Us Part 2's multiplayer was in trouble, and that if Days Gone did include a multiplayer suite on par with Saber's awesome World War Z project, it would further steal The Last of Us Part 2's thunder. I'm sure your willingness to adopt the latter theory is going to be directly tied to where you stand on The Last of Us Part 2 divide, and while my personal position in that debate should be made abundantly clear by this video, I will clearly state that Sony's desire to keep the budget down is much more likely the reason the multiplayer pitch was denied. That doesn't change the fact that Sony definitely did push Days Gone out the door before it was given the quality assurance they usually afford their first-party titles, which resulted in negative review scores and ultimately a game which failed insofar as the pitch for its sequel was denied. Now, it must be said that I think that the comments that John Garvin, who is one of the directors of Days Gone, made on David Jaffe's podcast,
if you love a game, buy it at fucking full price. I can't tell you how many times I've seen gamers say, yeah, I got that on sale.
But how do you know
PS
you
Plus
love a
or whatever.
game until you've played it?
I'm just saying you don't, but don't complain if a game doesn't get a sequel if it wasn't supported at launch. It's like God of War got, whatever number of millions of sales at launch, and Days Gone didn't.
Was misguided, out of touch, and inconsiderate to every player who bought his game on sale, loved it, and then recommended it to other people, which honestly pissed me off to the point that I considered skipping this PC port entirely. I understand his frustration with the situation because after playing the game I sort of feel the same way, but I do think his anger was misplaced and the target of his ire should be Sony, the publisher of the game who fumbled its launch, not the customers who gave his game their time, regardless of how many of them gave his game a full ticket price. That brings me to the main reason I made this video, because I really think Days Gone deserved a lot better than what it got. It's a far more ambitious project than The Last of Us Part 2, with better game mechanics, better game design, and a better story. The only things it lacks are the same level of polish and degree of cinematic expertise. Which, say what you will about Neil Druckmann, but he is very skilled at directing actors. I really disliked my time with The Last of Us Part 2. I think it's a very poorly designed game with bad game mechanics. The story is full of problems, none of which involve characters being LGBT or muscular, and his company abused the DMCA system prior to launch in order to unjustly silence critics. But I have to give him credit where it's due, or none of my criticisms will carry any weight. The cast, animators, and even the divisive director of The Last of Us Part 2 all did great jobs with those tasks, which may sound promising for the upcoming Last of Us TV show, but if the writing has the same inconsistent character motivations, then it may still end up falling flat. Again though, I really want to be as fair as I possibly can to Druckmann, the Last of Us franchise, and Naughty Dog as a company, and I don't want this video to come off as just being a Last of Us Part 2 hate boner, but I truly believe that the mainstream game media's insistence that the game was a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, while Days Gone was a 6 out of 10 forgettable open world game, is not simply inaccurate, it's potentially damaging to the future of the medium. Not catastrophic, as honestly nothing's ever going to stop the indie games development scene from being focused on gameplay, if for no other reason than budgetary necessity. But to me, the idea that a game which has so little gameplay, with what's there being so poorly designed, became so critically lauded, while another game with far better design and exponentially more gameplay, from the same publisher tackling a near identical concept, was treated like the family reject, could teach the industry that you win awards with flashy, extremely expensive cinematics, not by making a good game. So in order to combat that, I've made this video which will hopefully convince you that Days Gone will be worth your time, because I think if Sony sees a big spike in sales for the Steam version, it could achieve the twofold good of showing Sony that its Steam ports are a worthwhile investment, even for games which underperformed on console, and maybe, long shot as it may be, that the world of Days Gone is worth revisiting. Personally, I would love to see Sam Witwer saddle up his bike and continue Deacon's story, because of one thing is certain, it's that the dead don't ride.